So today we're going to talk about economic change, and we're going to talk about the interaction of different groups and organisations, otherwise known as stakeholders or players, and how they helped create this change and how it manifests itself in an actual place. So we get Liverpool in the 80s, we're having this pretty derelict and rundown waterfront, but now in modern day Liverpool it's a flourishing waterfront. Who had the influence to create that change, and how did it come about? So we need to define what is a player. And a player can be either individuals or it can be groups. But the main thing that we need to know is that they have an interest or some sort of influence over actions or the decisions. And when we're talking about actions and decisions about what, because we're talking in this course about places, this is about individuals or groups who have interest or some sort of influence over the decisions being made about a place and the processes that shape those places. So to look at a generic example, we might look at something like Westgate, the development in Oxford that we all know well. There would have been lots of players that would have had either an influence over could it get built or not, but also an interest of should it be built or not. So in terms of could it get built, you'd have to think the Oxford local council would have had a big role in giving planning permission and kind of also investment potentially for that. There would have been other groups that would have had a interest in this. So local shop owners thinking, would this take business away from their companies themselves? Local consumers. Obviously, some local consumers would have been very pro this in terms of it gives them new retail facilities, but others might think that it takes away and closes down other businesses. You've got to think of the actual TNCs big brands that would be interested in putting their companies into this building and being able to get the major investments. You even could look at national governments in terms of, do they have a role in providing finance to help finance a big project like this in the centre of Oxford to maybe encourage economic growth? Some of these would have had more influence and some of them would have had a more interest in this. What we need to realise about players is that in terms of placemaking and making economic change, not all players are equal in their influence. So a great way to think about this is to think about a sporting arena. So I'm going to take American football. In American football, there are certain players that have a lot of influence over who win the game. So I've got a picture here of Aaron Rodgers. He's the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. And he's the quarterback. So in an American football game, he makes a lot of decisions that can influence the game. He knows where to throw it. He chooses some of the plays. Similarly, a coach can also have a lot of influence over what happens to win that game. If you want to think of this in a placemaking sense, then Aaron Rodgers is the equivalent of a government or a local government. They have a lot of influence in what can happen and the decisions that get made or don't get made. But if you look in this bottom picture, this guy's the water boy. He has an interest in what happens in the game. He wants his team to win. He probably thinks he's got some opinions on how to win the game. But realistically, in terms of winning the game, he doesn't have a lot of influence. And you could think about this in terms of other players in a placemaker setting. Some people might have a lot of interest in it, but they might not have the influence. So a local support group might have a big interest in what happens in either economic change or the decisions made about a place, but they might not necessarily have a lot of influence or power to do it. So the key idea that not all places are equal, and sometimes we have quarterbacks that are on top, and then we have kind of water boys at the bottom, show that the kind of different players will have different amounts of influence and interest in what happens in places and with economic change. Now we're going to look at players that are actually involved in economic change and look at the ones that have a lot of influence and not so much influence. So if we talk about that quarterback role, that's often something like a government. And this can be a transnational government like the EU or national or local government. In terms of looking at the EU, they can have a real big impact on economic change by offering grants. And if we look at our case study of Liverpool and Toxteth, so Liverpool has in the last 6 years been given £221 million from EU in terms of grants. This has been used to make economic change because they've done a lot of investment in what we call the low carbon sector, which this is a case study that's in your textbooks. And what we mean by low carbon, this is investing in lots of offshore wind technology and jobs in the city connected to this. And one of the biggest offshore wind farms is just in Liverpool Bay. It's a place called Burbo Banks. And that is all because the EU gave money. So these grants are really important in creating economic change in the city. National governments work very similar to EU in terms of the influence they play. The national governments have departments and agencies that are very important in strategic planning. So their job is to try and sustain the economy and create employment and jobs, but also improving the environment. So we're trying to have economic change in a positive sense. And this can be sometimes centrally led organisations that are set up by the government to make change. An example of this in Liverpool again is something called the Merseyside Development Corporation, and this was set up in the 1980s by Margaret Thatcher, and she set this up to try and improve the area in terms of economics and employment, and she was focusing on the Mersey dockside. So this is focusing on a very specific area and trying to invest money in that area to make economic change. And I'll show you a couple of pictures in a second, but that very much changed that area from an area which was hugely in economic decline because of the loss of shipbuilding and replaced it kind of with retail opportunities. That is an example of a player having a lot of influence and bringing power and money into an area to make economic change, which in effect has an impact on quality of life and standard of living in the area. So you'd also get private players. These are businesses that are often trying to make profit for themselves. That would be their main interest in whatever happens in an area. And these can, again, vary on a scale from local businesses, but they could also go all the way up to TNCs or bigger companies. And so in Liverpool, we might say that in the Albert Docks, where there's a lot of big retail companies, they would have probably more influence than those local companies. And we can see when we talk about the Liverpool area in terms of private players that are having an influence, we've got a growth in the high-tech section of the city in the Liverpool Science Park. And so those organisations that are moving in there would have an influence in the economic change in that place because they're offering new tertiary and quaternary jobs into that area where they traditionally haven't had them before. So these players will have an influence. Can we link that back to the fact that the national government and the local government might be trying to invest in these? Yes, we can. So again, we need to show that these are probably the cause of local and national investment in these areas. So we have to make sure that these players don't kind of sit in isolation, that many of the players are actually linked together. The last group to really consider are the local and charity groups. And as I've said, with the local groups especially, they probably more are like your water boys. They've got an interest, but they probably don't have as much influence and power necessarily as some of the other ones like those governments or those private players, especially TNCs. So the local groups can be concerned in issues in their immediate area, And often this can be employment, but it can also be things such as housing. And so to relate it back to our case studies, Granby 4 Streets CLT is a community land trust, and that is run by the local community, and their job is to get affordable housing into an area that has had high levels of deprivation and poor housing stock. So they are interested in that, but as we said before, they will only have really influence in a very immediate area, so a very small area, literally only at about 4 street level in Liverpool. So it doesn't have a wide influence. It's just in its local area, and it's concerned with that. The other last group to mention is NGOs and charities, and these can be national charities, but they can also be local charities. And in the example of Liverpool, I've got a company called Kind here, who are an NGO, and they are their focus is on child poverty in Liverpool. So often groups like this have a particular focus, and they will focus on a particular area, and this will be related to economic change. They will be looking to see how big economic changes affects groups and places. So we can talk about lots of investment from companies coming in from TNCs and the government investing, but you might have, as we see in the case of Toxteth, a lot of the case those people can't access those jobs, and so we have people that are interested in those changes because sometimes the needs aren't met, and an NGO like Kind would be trying to deal with the consequences of economic change, but also looking at the big changes that were made and seeing if they were actually meeting the needs of the people that were the most vulnerable and the most poor.